Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Unfortunately, I'm having some technical difficulties, and so I'm not able to join you on video. But my name is Gina Picarella, and I'm one of the co founders of the Forward Collective. And the founders of the Forward Collective are entrepreneurs who are focused on future of work solutions. We saw an opportunity to bring startups and businesses in the community together to learn and to spark new ideas to lead a better workforce. And today I am excited to introduce our guests, Emily Adams and Laura Dooland, co-founders of Inclusion Analytics. And they are going to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace and the work that they are doing to help businesses get started on their DEI efforts and how to measure their impact. And with that, I will welcome to the stage Emily and Laura.
Thanks, Gina. I am Laura Brooks Dooland, and we are also experiencing some technical difficulties. Emily, for some reason, we can't hear her unless you have supersonic hearing. So I will be covering the presentation today, and she will be able to kind of join you in the chat, answering questions and that such. But we are the co-founders of Inclusion Analytics. We started our company in August of last year, and it stemmed from the work we did together in our PhD program. So I will go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so thanks for joining us today. We're really happy to be here. And with Inclusion Analytics, our vision is to create workplaces that work for all. We do this by focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, in the workplace. And we use a series of assessments to collect data and help companies understand which DEI efforts are successful, which ones need retooling or greater support for their intended impact. Today, we're going to spend some time talking about the importance of using data and measurement to support your DEI efforts. So the pandemic and the racial reckoning sparked in 2020 changed the way people view DEI. It became clear to companies that weren't focusing on DEI that they could no longer ignore it, and those that were tackling these issues shifted their thinking and the way they conceptualize their efforts. For example, prior to George Floyd's death, we heard a lot about individual hidden bias, but as you can see by this graph, the corporate discussion started to switch more to systemic racism, and that happened far more frequently in the corporate discussion starting in the second quarter of 2020. So this shift in focus changed from an individual person's beliefs and actions to changing our systems overall. Companies were starting to recognize that they need to own the responsibility of creating equitable workplaces, and so that started to kind of refocus the way they approach DEI. So as they were owning that responsibility, the conversation led to many lofty and public goals around demographic targets, money that was being allocated to equity in our communities, and more. Since businesses themselves are systems that can perpetrate negative outcomes, there is a lot of work that can be done with a company to improve these equitable outcomes. But many leaders are starting to realize that they're not really sure where to start with these actions or where they're able to make a difference. We believe that the answer is starting with data to have well-informed efforts. Dr. Laura Morgan Roberts and Megan Grayson said it well. Data provides an account of the current state, while goals establish the standards and metrics by which organizations demonstrate that they are becoming more inclusive, equitable, and representative. Without goals, leaders and organizations cannot hold themselves accountable for progress. We believe that DEI work is all about improvement over time, not the starting place. We can establish baselines using data and tracking our progress towards goals with follow-up measurement. Businesses that haven't started intentional DEI work and those that are mature in their DEI work both have opportunities to get better, but neither can demonstrate their success if they don't measure their efforts. Using a data-based approach focuses attention on investments that are most likely to support employees and be successful. When we think about DEI data, we look at 4 topic areas. We've utilized academic research, market research, and a compilation of discussions we've had with many company leaders to identify 4 areas. And although they can each be targeted on their own, they're most effective when they're examined in their interactive forces. So looking at demographics, or the diversity of the workforce, allows for critical reflection upon racial, gender, and other demographic representation throughout the company. In other words, do you have different viewpoints in the room? Policy reviews can identify systemic barriers for employees, customers, and partners that might be holding individuals back, as well as hindering business progress. Next, we encourage employee perceptions to be examined in order to understand whether the company's efforts are impacting the employees in the manner that they're intended. And finally, we believe that an inclusive culture is a critical lever for DEI success because efforts to attract diverse talent will fall short of retaining that talent if the culture does not support those new employees that they've gained. So next I'm going to go into a few examples of each of these types of metrics. So in the US, we're pretty used to collecting demographic data. For large corporations and government contractors, this has been a pretty common practice since the establishment of affirmative action in 1965. We ask for this information during application processes or once the employees are hired because we want to be sure that we're hiring a representative workforce in a fair manner. But it's also important to examine other decision-making points, such as promotion rates or turnover. For example, we often see the pattern of results indicated on the screen where women make up about 50% of the overall workforce of a company, but they're not promoted to management at the same rates as they enter the company. This is often called the broken rung phenomenon. Seeing results like these should lead to a critical examination of the promotion procedures to help mitigate and remove biases. Likewise, we would hope to see that women and people of other genders make up a proportional amount of workers in mission-critical roles, like widget making, for example, not just administrative or supportive roles. This parity is more easily achieved in some fields than others, which leads to discussions about investing in the pipeline of talent. Since the development of an external pipeline is fairly advanced, it's a long-term endeavor, and it usually takes the collaboration of a lot of organizations. Many organizations might first focus on their internal efforts, like reskilling or upskilling their employees. Understanding demographic representation at each level or different job functions can help to identify the gaps or areas of bias at which these different decision-making points might occur. The second quadrant of our DEI measurement circle is looking at policies. From the overall vision or the entire employee life cycle, companies can add policies or make small tweaks to policies to make them more inclusive. For example, one policy that became common practice in 2020 and seems like it might be sticking around is a hybrid or remote work option. So let's consider the example of a breastfeeding mother who may prefer to work from home to avoid having to clean pumping supplies in a break room or a bathroom. She may be able to quickly return to work without the hassle of changing floors to get to the lactation room, then heading back to the break room in order to clean her supplies and store milk. Because of the convenience and the time saved, she's likely to be even more productive working at home, in addition to feeling more comfortable. So even though this shift became popular because it helped to keep workers safe from the coronavirus, It's really a great option and can benefit many employees like working parents, those who rely on public transportation, or those with disabilities whose homes have been uniquely designed for their needs. Next, we recommend actually assessing the employee perceptions of those organizational policies and practices. As leaders and policymakers, it's really easy to get caught up in what's on the books, what do our policies say? But it's harder to keep up with what each individual manager is communicating to their team. Perhaps finance employees are getting policy consistent messages from their management, but the law employees report that they feel unable to take advantage of those company-wide policies. So using our prior example of the remote work arrangement, a first question might be simply, do you know what your company's remote work policy is? Sometimes we simply just need better communication in order to have our employees know what they have access to. Second, we might ask employees if they feel like they can fully utilize the remote work policy or if they think that negative repercussions will come from it. So in the example from our prior slide, if the breastfeeding mother feels like she might be passed up for promotions if she doesn't physically show up to the office, then she might not feel like the remote work policy is a sincere practice. And if it's not practice, is it really a policy at all? So we need to make sure that we're not only measuring what our policies are, but how our employees are experiencing those policies in order to understand how those efforts are impacting our employees the way that they're intended. And then finally, we recommend exploring your company's inclusion culture. This includes 4 factors which we consider important for inclusion. That's belonging, on the other side, exclusion, psychological safety, and fairness. Belonging looks at whether or not employees feel like they're valued and an important part of their teams. Exclusion examines whether people are feeling left out, for example, from important meetings or maybe even social functions. Fairness looks at whether employees believe the same rules apply equally to everyone. And psychological safety is the feeling that an employee can voice their dissent or their opinion without fear of negative repercussions. Together, these 4 elements constitute inclusive culture, and understanding employees' experiences in them helps leaders to develop better communication around policies and programs to make sure that the workplace is inclusive and welcoming for all. It's really important that we examine these dimensions on employee level and different demographic information as well. So overall, you might get results that say your employees feel pretty positively about your inclusion culture, but different groups are likely to have different experiences. For example, we might see that trans employees feel like they have psychological safety to contribute their opinions. They might feel like their supervisors are fair and that they're being included in important meetings. However, we might see that they don't really feel like they belong or can be their full selves at work, maybe not even able to disclose an invisible identity. Seeing results like this should help us to recognize we should examine different policies, like policies around pronouns, healthcare coverage, maybe even family policies, to make sure that our employees can show up to work as they truly are. So again, I'd like to reiterate here that these 4 areas of measurement can help organizations understand their DEI efforts, and understanding them as a whole can really help to focus attention and have the most impact on the next steps that are really important to improve our workplaces. So next, I can start a Q&A session. Feel free to drop questions in the chat. Okay, Adriana has a question. What information do companies typically have to provide? I'm assuming, is this in terms of what information should be collected or what information should be communicated to employees? Okay, so in terms of setting up data collection, I would say that in terms of setting up data collection, it depends on how the HR systems work. Sometimes demographic data is already in a system, otherwise that might need to be collected. In terms of setting up data gathering for a policy audit or review, that can be something that can be done just directly from an HR individual going through reviewing their policies against best practices. In terms of employee perceptions and inclusion, that needs to be done through either a survey link that's sent out to everyone, or you could do a focus group, something along those lines. But what you want to make sure is that that is coming from a safe source and that the employees know how that data is being collected, so that they know whether or not it's anonymized and safe to respond. They need to know how it's aggregated and those sort of things. Deb says, in the work you've done for the Chamber's Code Initiative, which of the 4 quadrants do you feel is the weak link right now? Oh, that is really interesting. Since all of them interact a lot, it's hard to say which one is the weak link. I would definitely say that overall, our organizations in Omaha have a ways to go in terms of policies. A lot of organizations are just getting started and they're putting a lot of work into those foundations. And then I would say as well, when it comes to the inclusion side of things, that maybe not necessarily is the weakest link, but that's the area where we were noticing most leaders were having their aha moments. And a lot of organizations are focused on, we treat everyone like a family, we feel really connected, and then once they see their data broken down through the different demographics, they realize that that's not happening equitably for all of their employees. So I wouldn't necessarily have to say that that's the weakest link, but that is the area that the intentions are, people are starting to realize that their intentions are not being impactful. That is a really interesting question. So Keith asked, without getting too political, how does the recent conversation around critical race theory affect your work, or how will it? Okay, I'm going to try not to get too political here, but I would say that, we need to name things. There's a lot of shift from the colorblind approach to a more multicultural approach, and if we don't name things for what they are and provide the history around where we are today, then it becomes really difficult to move forward and fix our problems. And so I think being able to recognize the way systems work is the first step to understanding how we can improve those systems. How would you say inclusion analytics approach is different to others that do this work? That's a great question. So I would say that based on the information that we gathered prior to developing our tool, we saw all of these focus areas broken up. So you could go to this company and you could get a diversity scorecard, and it would tell you whether or not your workplace was representative. You could go to this organization and get employee engagement and understand how engaged your employees were and break that down by demographics. But we weren't finding any tools that were providing the interactive effects of the policies along with the employees' direct responses to those policies and understanding the gaps. And that's why we developed the tools that we created and the assessments that we had. Do you help companies with language when they are gathering data for their employees to ensure you are getting candid feedback? That is a really great question. We absolutely do help with language in terms of explaining what we're collecting, explaining why we are collecting it, and explaining how it is safe. I think there's a lot of fear around being identified, rightfully so. If you're not being treated well in your organization, then you're not going to feel comfortable speaking up. But if you understand the minimum thresholds and how the data is anonymized, then you might feel more comfortable providing your full feedback. On top of that, we work with the organizations to make sure that our language simply aligns with their language. If they call their managers people managers or something along those lines, we want to make sure that all of that aligns so people know what they're answering questions for. Good. So Deb's question, what is your reporting threshold for looking at specific demographic segments? That's a really good question. Usually it depends on the size of the organization. If I would say that 20% is a good threshold if your organization is large enough. Now, if you have an organization that's 50 people, a 20% threshold is not going to be anonymous. So it really depends on how large the organization is. Yes, exactly. So Deb says the reason she's asking is that the groups are really small, and so it's hard to break out some of the information. And that's really tricky because we want to make sure that everyone's voices are heard, but we don't want to put a target on anyone's back. So making sure that if we're seeing patterns before we aggregate it, we understand where those patterns are coming from, and maybe we can provide a larger group that's not as obvious. Otherwise, the safety of employees is priority number one. How do you feel Omaha-Lincoln compares to the rest of the country? Any positive or concerning trends? Based on the research that we've done, it looks like we have very similar patterns in Omaha and Lincoln. The concerning trends are throughout our country. That is definitely a fact. But when we're looking at that broken wrong issue we were talking about with getting women and employees of color into management positions, that is happening throughout our country. And then I would say that honestly, maybe hiring is lower in Omaha and Lincoln, and that getting people in the door might be our first step, especially now that we're becoming even more, we have more global competition. We're trying to get employees who have opportunities to stay in Omaha, but work on the coast, work for organizations in different countries. And so trying to make sure that they stay here and work for our organizations is going to just continue to get harder and harder. How does the concept of intersectionality play into how you collect data or give back results? That is a really great question that ties to your previous question, Deb, of we have to make sure that we have that threshold. So we are always looking at intersectionality in terms of gender and race, gender and sexual orientation, race and sexual orientation. So that we examine those, but again, we have to make sure that we have enough individuals in each of those categories to provide the data in a safe manner. And that there are enough categories there that we can give information to show any differences. If there's only one category of intersectionality that is safe to show, then it doesn't really provide us very much interesting information. All right. Well, it looks like we are coming up on the end of the presentation, so we will close out here. Thank you, everyone, for your great questions and the helping us out through all of the technical difficulties.
And I will say, I know Gina cannot connect her audio, but on behalf of the Forward Collective, thank you so much for coming over and sharing with us what you're doing. We think it's such important work and part of what we need in order to create a better future of work. For everyone else attending, be on the lookout for a future event. It'll be an exciting one. Thank you so much.